the start, I'm not an energy expert. I look at energy from the point of view how this, for example, impacts the region in terms of its, for example, accession process or accession obstacles towards the European Union integration process. But I also look at energy in terms of how individual non-EU external actors, and with external actors, I primarily mean countries. Although I acknowledge that external actors can also be institutions, for example, financial institutions like the IMF or the World Bank. I focus on countries and I emphasize non-EU external actors who use energy policy in order to either establish or to enlarge their footprint in Southeastern Europe. And I'd like to give you, over the course of this presentation, some examples for that. I'm happy to be interrupted as a course of action if I talk nonsense or use language technical that is not clear right away. Please feel free to interrupt me. What can I offer as some takeaways that hopefully when you open the door and then leave for your well-deserved Christmas break, what could you possibly then or hopefully think about? As I've just highlighted, external actors are key to the region's energy policies. These actors are, for example, China, as I'm going to highlight in a moment. They are active in different areas of energy, in particular in fossil fuel energy sectors. There is some debate to what degree nuclear energy is part of the traditional mix of energy policies and external actors. What we can observe over the course of the past years is that countries in the region are actually also trying to diversify, to enlarge, to transition the mix of their energy policies. And this diversification process is a work in progress, and it is one that tries to also address some of the structural challenges that these countries face when transitioning, for example, to what we call green energy opportunities. The interesting thing is, in this process of transition, every country in the region has, for a variety of reasons, adhered to the EU sanctions packages, and in a number of cases has identified so-called carve-outs, which again highlight the specifics of individual countries who still have or depend on, for example, the delivery of Russian pipeline gas supplies, and therefore need carve-outs from sanctions packages that have been executed through the European Union, through the United Nations, the US administration, or various other individual countries. The Russian invasion has given added, if I may use the metaphor for a moment, added fuel to that process of diversification, added energy, also added urgency to that process of diversification. But I would argue that it is not the single or the prime reason, but it has accelerated it. Let me first give you a flavor of what is happening on the ground in individual countries. And when I say Southeastern Europe, I include Turkey. That's why I don't use the term Western Balkans. That would be geographically, economically, historically far too limited. Southeastern Europe, for me, gives me the opportunity to include a country like Turkey, because I think it is very instructive to see how Turkey is engaged in the regional energy policy developments. These are here just 3 examples where you can identify how, for example, on the left-hand side, there's an agreement between the Chinese and the Turkish foreign minister about the construction, an initial memorandum of understanding that was signed a few months ago between China and Turkey, construction of a nuclear power plant in Turkey. Is anybody from Turkey here? No? Because I would have asked, with regard to Clarelli, this is a region where it is actually a high-risk region to build a nuclear power plant because it's an earthquake region. It is one that has been characterized by seismographic developments where the risk of an earthquake is high. But you also have, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the construction of a hydropower plant, which the Chinese are building. And you have, for example, here on the right-hand side, large Chinese investment in copper mine in Serbia. And in that copper mine, not only do we have substantial amounts of financial investment from the Chinese side, but you also have, as I will highlight a little bit later, you have substantial public reaction to that investment in terms of its environmental impact, its environmental consequences. Because digging deep for copper is important for China for reasons of its electrical vehicle production and its accessibility to so-called rare earths to which copper belongs from the Chinese perspective. But it has large environmental consequences regarding, for example, access to water in that region. What I want to just tell you with these 3 short examples is the following. There are a variety of highly controversial, but substantial, expensive energy projects that are taking place in Southeastern Europe with the impact of external actors. And it is interesting to observe that, for example, in Turkey, you see that the Chinese agreed to build a nuclear reactor. They are not the first to do that in Turkey. Russia is currently completing the first nuclear reactor in Turkey. What does that tell you if you just try and maybe reach a conclusion about these 3 examples? Could somebody of you venture an explanation? What kind of conclusion would you draw from that? Somebody please find their car. Have I brought you to such a silence that it is impossible to speculate? Please.
For me, it's surprising that it's not the local government that decides to put a power plant into place, whether it's hydro energy or nuclear. So maybe, yeah, maybe the knowledge is missing or it's too expensive. I'm finding it hard to explain because it's obviously a core duty of the government to provide energy.
It's interesting that you mentioned local government. All of these projects are elite-driven projects in terms of government-to-government agreements. There is very little, if at all, local involvement, local participation, or even consultation. This is part of the reason, as I shall highlight later, why there is actually a growing element of pushback against such projects in the region. Good point, and thank you for taking the field. Let me highlight some of the structural challenges that policymakers from the region face when we are looking at energy policies. The map that I have highlighted here tells you something about the dark blue EU member states. It tells you something about Turkey, Armenia, and also Norway, who are observers, and the yellow countries are so-called contract participants in the energy community. I'll explain in a moment what that is. How countries who are members of the EU and non-EU member states actually form an energy community that is based in Vienna, and why this is important, or why this in the future is potentially important. But first, with regard to the energy systems, one structural characteristic to underline is they are outdated. They are outdated in terms of their energy mix. They are outdated in terms of their manufacturing capacity, and they are outdated in terms of their governance structure. Most of the energy, the majority of the energy that is still produced and converted into electricity is based on burning lignite coal in the region. And any one of you, is anybody from the region, from Bosnia-Herzegovina, from Kosovo or Serbia? Here. Croatia? No? But you've visited the region. You've been to Belgrade, Skopje, Sarajevo, that you may be sometimes familiar with in the winter, in particular, air quality, when you have to be out on the streets and you immediately get a sense of the sulfur that is in the air because of the manner in which how people use electricity based on lignite coal burning. There's chronic underinvestment in the region. Underinvestment cannot come as a surprise given the economic and financial conditions of the individual countries. Given also the lack of financial capacity that private households have to transition to another energy mix, or given, for example, individual companies to at least reconsider how they should, for example, build their towers in a lignite coal-fired plant and what kind of filters should be put in them. So a lack of resources, be that financial, be it infrastructure, characterizes such outdated systems. All these countries do not yet have a binding phasing out of coal. We have in Germany and in other countries, we have roadmaps, we have timetables, and we have a public controversy about the phasing out. But we at least have a timetable, and we have steps in that direction. Many of the countries here, with one exception, and that's Albania, do not have that. There are individual companies who commit to such a phasing out, but it is not an overarching, agreed and executed policy priority. What countries in the region are trying to do, and I will give example how this is taking place, is gradually to actually not stand alone anymore, to reach some form of interconnectivity, some form of cross-border cooperation. Russia's invasion in Ukraine has triggered that to a certain degree. An understanding that you not only have to diversify your energy resources, but you also have to diversify and expand the infrastructure that brings the energy into a country, to a city, or to a household. And that's where, for example, the Vienna-based energy community comes in. This is a community where, as I said a moment ago, countries that are members of the EU and that are not members Some of them are candidate countries or accession countries to the EU. Hence, they are negotiating future membership. But all who have signed commitments as members of the Energy Community have to adhere to EU policy recommendations on energy. It is one of the few policy areas where you can actually argue the case that even if you are not a member of the EU, you adhere to EU rules and principles in one specific policy area, namely energy. That's on paper. The reality on the ground is such that many of these countries cannot honor what they have signed on to. And the European Commission and some of its auxiliary organizations do not have the enforcement means nor the financial resources to make these countries adhere to what they have signed up to. So while the energy community is an interesting development and receives from time to time praise for its efforts, it is far too small in terms of impact on the ground. As I said in my introduction, the region is characterized by the involvement, the presence, the footprint, and in some cases, the expanding footprint of non-EU external actors. The interesting thing when I say non-EU, and I highlight countries like China, Russia, Azerbaijan, the interesting thing is the widespread absence of one other country. Which country could that be? Which country haven't I mentioned as a large, impactful, non-EU external actor? Please, that's right. Some of the capacity of non-EU external actors to have an expanding footprint in Southeastern Europe, in the energy area, is due to the fact that the United States has withdrawn from that policy area. My last point here is about shocks, about exogenous shocks, which have in the region, but not only there, contributed to cement a status quo. What kind of exogenous shocks in the past years are we talking about? Please.
Gas price shock.
Yes, that's one. Based on, where did it come from? That's it, bravo. That's one. What's the second one? Indeed. These kind of exogenous shocks have forced countries, companies, private households to react to them. I'll give you an example how this is taking place. But reacting to them has, in many cases, reinforced the status quo, hence making a transition all the more challenging. I'd like to now give you a flavor of some country examples, and I've chosen 3. There's no preference in these 3, but I think I can highlight there what kind of challenges are we facing, what kind of opportunities exist, and who can, in a way, exercise agency in making this possible. Serbia is a very good example of a country which has relied over decades on the availability of Russian gas supplies. Russian gas supplies here means primarily pipeline gas. This may sound like a small technical difference to you, but it is one with huge political consequences. There are two versions of available in countries. That's pipeline gas and that's liquefied natural gas. Pipeline gas is currently subject to sanctions from the European Union. Liquefied natural gas from Russia is not subject to sanctions, not for EU countries, not for non-EU countries. Serbia receives the majority of its gas supplies through pipeline gas from Russia. It has not signed up to the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia. This is an element that is controversial because Serbia is at the same time negotiating with the European Union EU membership. So you have a conflict here about how do you adhere to, how do you integrate into your policy mix requirements in foreign and security policy. And energy is part of foreign and security policy in the negotiation package between Brussels and Belgrade. Even after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, Serbia signed long-term gas supply contracts with Russia, hence in a way exposing the frailty of sanctions packages. Serbia receives, regarding the pipeline infrastructure across southeastern Europe, its gas through Bulgaria. That's an interesting element for somebody of you who may be looking deeper into the subject matter. Bulgaria has been sanctioned by Russia and doesn't receive any gas from Russia, but it is contractually committed to supply through its pipeline network Serbia. That's part of the complexity or contradiction of energy policies in the region. There are countries that have been sanctioned, but that are under obligation to be used as transit countries for others, for third parties. But what you can also observe, and I return to the point I made at the beginning, that Serbia is an example of a country that is starting to understand that relying almost exclusively on one providing country, Russia, is possibly not the most intelligent policy decision going forward. Hence, even under a very authoritarian government structure as exists in Serbia, with President Vučić, who some of you may have heard about it, just won the parliamentary elections on Sunday in Serbia, has reached out to other providers regarding gas supplies. And it has inaugurated a few days ago a gas interconnector between Serbia and Bulgaria, where Azerbaijan will provide gas to Serbia. Hence, you can see, may sound small to you, for Serbia, it is important that there is movement in that area. Countries that do not support sanctions, that have a history of cooperation with Russia, nevertheless are starting to diversify their energy supply resources and reaching out to other countries. Let me go to the next country. Is anybody from Bulgaria here? Ah, bravo. And this may sound familiar to you. And please feel free to chip in terms of additional information. Why have I chosen Bulgaria? Because I'd just like to give you the flavor of the whole controversy, complexity, and contradictions that sometimes are inherent in energy policy and the attempt, at least the attempt, to redefine energy policy making in your country. The Hungarian government, the Bulgarian government, I'm sorry, wanted to introduce the gas tax in just 2 months ago. It was a tax against the provider of Russian gas, Gazprom, not to Bulgaria because it is sanctioned. And as I said, it's a transit country, but to 3 other countries in the region, Hungary, Serbia, and North Macedonia. A gas tax that Gazprom would have had to pay and which would have increased substantially the price of gas arriving in Hungary, in North Macedonia, and in Serbia, because transit fees would have increased. Hence, it was an attempt by the Bulgarian government to squeeze the single largest gas supplier from Russia out of the European market via other countries, Gazprom. As I said, there are sanctions packages that have been adopted against Russian gas with exemptions that apply to individual countries. But what has happened in practice? Of the 3 countries that were subject to such consequences, the 3 countries would not have had to pay the tax, but they would have had to have additional fees through the transit, and it would have made gas more expensive. One country is a European Union member, Hungary. And Hungary threatened at the European Council that if that transit gas is implemented, not only adopted, but then also carried through by Bulgaria, then it would veto Bulgaria's year-long attempt to finally be admitted into the passport-free travel area called Schengen. So here you see a form of interconnectivity of policy areas that tell you something about leverage, about policy leverage that countries can exercise, and they use energy against cross-border free travel in the Schengen area. And it led to the Bulgarian government trying to save face just a few days ago to actually call off this gas tax. That's where you can see that an initially possibly interesting, nevertheless controversial issue in energy policy, how it gets mixed up, how it gets integrated in larger controversial policy issues, and then dies a quick death. You're from Bulgaria. Would you like to add something to it? Have I forgotten something or put it in a different light?
Maybe I would say that also Austria is in this pipeline.
Austria, yes, indeed. You're right. I focus on the countries of Southeastern Europe. But Austria is also a receiving country, indeed. But Austria is not the one who threatened the veto. Only Hungary did that.
Actually, it's not so the case.
Yeah.
Austria is the main country in the European Union who has veto against Bulgaria in Schengen zone. And there are some voices that say that actually Bulgaria put these taxes in order to tell the Austrians that we can use these pipelines. And so it's not really.
Then it's good that you correct me and you know more than me, because based on the information that I was able to collect, I thought the driving force there was Hungary, not Austria.
Not yes.
Okay. Okay.
But depending on the way how we see it, because Bulgaria first did this action. And to be honest, this action is highly controversial because taxation, okay, the government cannot taxate Gazprom. The government can taxate the operator.
Yeah.
And the operator is a Bulgarian firm.
Yes.
So it's much more complicated.
Gazprom would never have paid it.
Yes.
Yes. But you get a flavor of our short conversation. It's complicated. And what may appear as a rather important political objective also gets politicized quickly. It's part of a political battlefield where then other topics come into the mix. Let me focus for a moment on Turkey. Why should we focus on Turkey? I think it's a good example of how geopolitics actually intervene into energy policy making in the country. As I said at the beginning, Russia is just about to complete the construction of the first nuclear power plant in Turkey. The Chinese are building a coal-fired power plant in Turkey. And as I said at the beginning with this second slide, China has agreed with the Turkish government to build the second nuclear reactor in the country. What does that tell you? If China and Russia in different areas of energy policy are starting to have such a visible and expanding footprint in Turkey. Please.
Like the big players are trying to expand their influence on Turkey?
What do you mean with influence?
Because, so like by expanding the economical and energetical cooperation, they expand their influence on the Turkish government too, because they are more tied between the governments. And if the gas plant is built by Russians, then they always can say, we will stop it, we will stop the building until you do this and that, I guess.
That would be not very smart to threaten Turkey like that. I don't exclude it, but I don't think it's smart politics. Sure. I don't think that Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan talk like that to each other. But you're not completely wrong. I'll come back to it in a moment. Anybody else venture a guess, please? Maybe focus first on just the energy issue of two major geopolitical actors having a footprint in Turkey. What does that tell you? Narrow it down to the energy issue for a moment. Instead of influence, maybe if I give you a hint, dependency. Does that allow for some consideration on your part? What kind of dependency would be at work here? Somebody's got to try and do it. I'm not going to do it right now. I'm going to come back to you for a moment. I'll take him to encourage him, please.
Thank you for encouraging. Well, I mean, it's a dependency of, so this power plant, the nuclear power plant, coal-fired power plant would be in some way some part of the Turkish energy, and let's say engineers that know these plants that might come from Russia or China. And so some part of the energy availability in Turkey will depend on, for example, Russian maybe parts, technology, engineers, and Chinese one. But it's something I wanted to add is that it's wondering how much of the energy, because in Germany the tendency was very strong in the sense that we had huge gas pipelines, and this was a large amount of our energy. This is the case in Turkey as well. It's one power plant and one coal plant. Okay, it's some kind of tendency, but it's not a huge one yet.
I'll come back to it in a moment, please.
I know it's right, I think, with something because you were kind of urging us to. I'm asking myself the question, like, why didn't Turkey build it by themselves? Like, why didn't they help building it? And I also I agree with the point that it's not that much of a dependency when it's like a kind of like autonomic nuclear reactor, because you don't have like a pipeline where you can just shut down the stream of oil or gas. So it's a little bit difficult. I'm just like guessing.
The energy resource that Turkey has available in abundance is coal. About 40% of its energy manufacturing capacity comes from coal. Otherwise, Turkey is not a country with energy producing capacity. That's why, if you look at the trade numbers between Turkey and Russia since 2 years, they have exponentially increased, because as Turkey also does not participate in the sanctions regime against Russia, they have increased many-folds their import of sanctioned Russian oil, fossil oil. And therefore, you're quite right in saying if it would be only one, then the dependency issue exists, but one shouldn't also overstate the fact. But what Turkey is doing, in my view, is actually creating further examples of dependency long-term. If you build a nuclear reactor, and right now it's not that important if it's from Russia or from China or from anywhere else, and Turkey does not have the manufacturing capacity to do that on its own. And sometimes it is politically easier to actually have a third party from outside build it. You have less, for example, reaction from civil society on the ground to that, because you don't target a Turkish company then. But building a nuclear reactor, for example, in Turkey, and possibly a second one also, creates a dependency over many decades, because you need, for example, the import of nuclear fuel rods. There are countries that have Soviet-era nuclear reactors in the European Union. Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, France even. Even the United States imports nuclear fuel rods from Russia. They are not part of the sanctions packages, the 12 that have been adopted so far. So here Russia continues to have an opening into energy policy making in the European Union and also outside the EU. And that is one that is long-term, because until you have reconfigured a Soviet-era built nuclear reactor that uses nuclear fuel rods from Russia, and you try and diversify that to French or US American, it takes time, it's expensive. You may have to shut down the facility, and so on and so forth. Turkey is an example of, you already had high exposure of energy dependency regarding the import of oil from Russia. You're increasing that now with future dependency regarding nuclear reactors. But Turkey is also an example of something else. I've mentioned in some of the pipeline examples prior that much of the gas that countries receive also travels, for example, through pipeline infrastructure from Azerbaijan and from Turkey. I've highlighted here, I hope you can see, can you see some of the pipeline infrastructure that I've highlighted on the right-hand side? How the so-called Turk Stream gas pipeline is geographically structured. How it leaves southwestern Russia and then travels by and large 900 kilometers in order to then arrive at different ports in Turkey and then onward to neighboring countries. if you look at how it travels through the Black Sea and some of the neighboring countries, what is one characteristic of Turk Stream, if you look at the geography? I know it's a little bit difficult, but I'd just like to try and tease you a bit. Is there something that, in terms of geopolitics, geostrategy, catches your attention from that kind of a pipeline infrastructure? Please.
I could say that the most fragmented feature on the map is that it doesn't go through.
That's what I wanted to cover.
It goes like network.
Indeed. It bypasses the debate. It doesn't interfere into the whole debate. Are you possibly through Ukraine doing that through occupied parts of Ukraine? Are you taking gas from Ukraine and so on and so forth? Because we have that debate, for example, about Ukrainian wheat, that there are very substantial allegations that the Russian wheat exports through Ukraine are actually stolen. All this discussion with regard to the Turk Stream pipeline cooperation between Turkey and Russia, we do not have that. That's a strategic decision on the part of Turk Stream to bypass Ukraine. So let me first give you some initial concluding arguments. I've talked about regional energy cooperation, something that is starting to become feasible, operational in individual countries of Southeastern Europe. There are examples of cooperation that are taking place, that are expanding, and that tell you something about how countries, given when this is taking place in 22 and 23, how countries are starting to diversify their energy policy, their infrastructure capacity. Something that you would not have seen 2 years ago is now happening, that Serbia receives gas from Azerbaijan is a new development. It reacts to geopolitical developments, to geopolitical challenges. But also, you see that Serbia and Bulgaria are reaching out to each other through a pipeline connector. You see in the region also how LNG terminals are being built or expanded or connected to a grid, to a liquefied natural gas grid with other countries, so that you enlarge the infrastructure of cooperation, for example, between Croatia and Austria. And the most important one is somebody from Greece here? No? The most important element of cooperation that we see in Southeastern Europe is the so-called ING, the interconnector Greece-Bulgaria, IGB, I'm sorry, the interconnector Greece-Bulgaria, which is now operational since almost 6 months. It took long to build, and which has the capacity for LNG, liquefied natural gas supplies throughout the region. These are examples that if I would give that presentation 2 years ago, would not have been possible. Something has happened in these 2 years that have stimulated, encouraged, or forced, obliged countries to reach out to neighboring countries and to establish a network of interconnectivity, of cooperation that you did not see before. I find that one of the most remarkable developments in the region. Now, you see, in preparing this presentation, sometimes my German gets mixed up with my English. So the news is not enough. I want to take your attention for a few minutes now to the aspect of civil society, to the aspect of social consequences of energy policy making, of the situation on the ground, day-to-day experiences that citizens, companies, but also local authorities, regional authorities face with regard to energy policy making in Southeastern Europe. And this is a random mix of news that I have taken from 1 week only. And this is before the winter has arrived in the country. And it is about how in Slovenia or in Serbia, in North Macedonia, again in Serbia and in Albania, you have different examples of energy developments, energy challenges, but also how citizens react to these challenges. Or in the case of Albania, how a constitutional court limits the capacity of a government to enforce certain policy making or certain projects associated with that policy. But it also tells you something else if you look at the first examples. The first example, Slovenia, flood damage to agriculture. What is that about in energy policy making? Flood damage to agriculture. And in a country like Slovenia, 145 million damage in agriculture is severe. What is that about? What's the underlying issue in energy policy here? Climate change. How do you react to flooding or to its opposite, drought in the region? What kind of energy consequences does that have? For example, for the capacity, production capacity of an important sector, and all these countries are still characterized by agriculture being an important sector in terms of employment, in terms of its share of annual GDP, economic performance of the country. How green is Southeastern Europe? Is a question that citizens are asking themselves on a daily basis. I've highlighted here 2 examples in terms of, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, this is a public demonstration that took place in Skopje in 2019. And on the other hand, this is an example of a natural park that has been consecrated as a national park with certain limitations in terms of tourism, in terms of building, but also in terms of how energy is used in Albania. What I want to highlight here is the following in terms of energy policy. There is not only the elite government level that I've highlighted so far. There is also something that is happening from the grassroots development in these countries. Environmental issues are on the agenda. They are hitting home. They are in many ways on the rise, and policy making has to react to it. You can see that the awareness, public awareness for issues, challenges like climate change is increasing in the region. There are examples for that, some of them in terms of the consequences of flooding, but you also have the opposite example of that, namely when there are droughts, and many of the countries in the region produce their electricity through hydropower, smaller or larger hydropower facilities. But through drought, you lose the capacity, or at least your capacity declines considerably to produce electricity through hydropower. Hence, the consequence of that is rationing of electricity and higher pricing of electricity, which again then rings home to those who depend on electricity through a national grid that is characterized by either coal, lignite, or by hydropower. But you can also argue the case that although environmental awareness is rising in these countries, and there is a public sense of we need to do something about this, and this goes across generations in these countries, it is not yet reflected in green parties actually being politically successful. By that I mean being represented in large numbers in parliament, let alone in government. Take, for example, the case of Bosnia. The Green Party, as it is called in Bosnia, was only established this year in March. There was no Green Party before that. There were environmental movements, but no Green Party. In Bulgaria, and you may remember that again, in the Kirill Petkov government when he was prime minister, do you remember the Green Movement Party as being part of the coalition? No? That's interesting. In Bulgaria, the Green Movement Party was part of the Petkov coalition in 21-22. And Borislav Sandov, remember that name? Borislav Sandov? He was the environmental minister. It was one of the very few examples where a representative from a Green Party not only was in parliament, but also was in government as an environmental minister for 8 months. That's possibly why you may not remember it, and I don't blame you for it. But then you have an example, Croatia. Croatia is a country with an abundance of sun, and solar energy makes 3% of the energy mix in 2021. 3% in a country with an abundance of solar energy manufacturing capacity. But some citizens in Croatia are innovative, are imaginative, and they say if it doesn't happen at the elite level, then we have to do it at the local level. The island of Kres in the Adriatic, Kres, C-R-E-S. The island of Kres has established the first entirely solar-generated electricity grid on that small island. And how did they do it? Crowdfunded. They created a crowdfunded, the citizens of that island created a crowdfunded platform to get the necessary funding, financing, in order to install solar energy capacity on the island. It's a small drop in the ocean, but nevertheless, it tells you something about it's a work in progress. There is movement there. And there are examples which are encouraging. Still, these encouraging examples, they face challenges because energy policy cannot be separated in that region of Southeastern Europe from social aspects, from socioeconomic conditions, from challenges that citizens face on a daily basis with regard to the cost of living, cost of energy, and how they are often forced to turn to fossil fuel for home heating. Why is that the case? If you look here at the subsidy price that I've highlighted for electricity based on coal. This is the price for the kilowatt hour in Serbia in 2023, and that's the price in the EU. You can understand it's cheap and it's necessary, therefore, for many, because it's without an alternative for them. Otherwise, they have to decide, as one observer called it, do you eat or heat? Heavily subsidized energy, traditional energy manufacturing, is for many still an alternative that they cannot ignore in their day-to-day life. And that applies to households, it applies to businesses, and therefore you have consequences that are highlighted here in terms of the air pollution, the air quality that in particular in the winter in cities like Sarajevo and Skopje and Belgrade are pathetic. Or to put it otherwise, just highly dangerous. And sometimes you have health advisories that say, do not take your children out on the streets of Belgrade in December or January. There is an effort to make the price of energy based on coal more expensive. There are international organizations calling for it. But the reputation of these organizations is such that they frequently then are seen in the eyes of others as disqualifying themselves. The International Monetary Fund has repeatedly urged the Serbian government to increase the price of electricity or to abolish the subsidies, because it also has budgetary consequences. But the Serbian government will not do it. So the financial transition away from coal is difficult. It is controversial. And in many ways, bear this also in mind, such lignite-producing power grids are public entities. That means they are not only an energy producer, they're also a very large employment provider. Employment provider means citizens and households who have a voice, and in many cases also a vote. And you do not want to necessarily have them against you. I said at the beginning of my presentation that there is one country that has no coal-fired power plant anymore. To the surprise of myself, when I started looking into these issues, it's Albania. All the others, and you can see here how in different countries the numbers are larger or smaller. This is from 2021. How these number of coal-fired power plants add up today to 18 such facilities. 18 compared to the 16 here in the table, because Serbia opened 2 further facilities. That tells you something about dependency, share of coal in power generation, how large it is, hence how difficult it is to reduce that also. It tells you something that it is not only an energy source, but also an employer. But the interesting thing also is here that because the energy produced is so cheap, Serbia is a country, for example, where you still have exports of coal, lignite coal-produced electricity to the European Union. Serbia currently exports such electricity to the Czech Republic and to Hungary. And Bosnia-Herzegovina currently exports its lignite manufactured electricity to Croatia and Italy. Hence the debate about reduce your coal dependency actually also arrives at the doorsteps of the EU. And the EU is challenged in individual countries. What do we do in terms of where we get our energy sources from? In particular, if it is cheap energy, but based on a structure that is either outdated or banned in individual countries. Germany has banned the production of coal, of electricity based on coal. It currently does not receive such electricity from these countries, but it receives, for example, nuclear energy imports from France. How long do you usually go in this seminar?
Up to 45.
Up to 45. Good, and then we still have some time.
Another 20 minutes.
Good.
But maybe we can have some questions, maybe some 10 minutes at the end.
Then let me give you a few conclusions. I think that in this presentation, or I hope that you've received a flavor of the region cannot be separated from geopolitics anymore. And these geopolitics also translate into the whole debate on energy. Manufacturing, distribution, infrastructure, and energy transition. Second aspect is there is growing evidence, even if it does not yet have the political impact that one desires. There is nevertheless growing evidence that civil society is challenging the status quo in these countries. But it will take time, given the levels of dependency that I've highlighted, that coal, in order to reduce it, in order to also identify it as an outdated source, that will require time. And various countries in the region have secured exemptions in terms of their transition periods that they are allocated. There's one major challenge that all these countries face starting in 2026, and that is, you may know that also from the German conversation, there's going to be the introduction by the European Union of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the so-called CBAM. This is something that applies to countries if they are or if they are not members of the EU. That will mean countries who export carbon-intensive electricity based, for example, on lignite coal from Southeastern Europe to the EU, these countries will have to pay fees for that export capacity. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe, in Southeastern Europe, if they have to pay, starting in 2026, that level of fees as they are currently defined, it would bankrupt them. This is a huge financial challenge that transits into the energy debate. Do you place a financial burden on these countries, which actually either has consequences for their budget, and they will have to make budget cuts, or that they will have to transition to other sources of energy manufacturing for which they are not prepared in terms of infrastructure, in terms of access to alternative sources of energy. So one debate is, while these countries are negotiating with the European Union, can we have longer transition periods in order to adopt and implement the so-called CBAM requirements of the European Union? At the end, I've given you some further food for thought for anybody who is interested in this debate, because I think you can learn a lot over and above the aspect of energy. But you take energy, and with that policy area, you then have a whole wide area of debate on geopolitics, on external actors, on the role of the EU, on civil society, challenging policy making of elites. Many of the aspects that you've discussed in other periods of this seminar series then translate into this with regard to energy. I'll stop here. I'll rest my case. Thank you for your energy, that you've had that amount of patience. I'm open for any question or comment.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting and stimulating talk. What 15 minutes left. So we'll go with questions, remarks.